The Mega Man franchise is no stranger to first game syndrome, the classic and Battle Network series being good examples of this, and it's certainly true of the Zero games as well. The first had a strong concept, but with the way things were laid out, it just made it really hard to play or recommend. Luckily, like with the other two examples, the second game is when things started to come together, Zero 2 being a massive improvement over its predecessor, and yet, this outing is the only one in the series that I really dislike. I feel like a crazy person since the sequel manages to address pretty much all my complaints from the original, yet my preferences still seem to reflect the opposite. What's the deal here? Does Zero 2 manage to fix all the problems of the past while creating a whole slew of new ones? Does this one just do a few oddball things that aren't necessarily bad, but just don't click with me? Or am I an idiot who doesn't know what they want? I'm Wes the Explosion, and I think it's about time I got to the bottom of this. This game takes place a year after the original title, Zero wandering about, fighting the forces of Neo Arcadia on his own. He's nearly at his limit and after a battle with a mechanaloid, passes out and is whisked off to the new Resistance base by a secret admirer. Once there, you get up to speed on things. Ciel has stepped down as leader of the Resistance, and the new commander, El Piso, has united the Reploids ousted by Neo Arcadia. Ciel is working on an alternative energy source to end the conflict, while El Piso thinks that defeating Neo Arcadia directly is the only solution. Zero, while seeing his aim as too short-sighted and simplistic, still agrees to help El Piso with various missions. And as you can probably guess, things go sideways partway through the game. That's the basic premise, and honestly, despite what I said last time about each of the Zero titles leading into each other, this is probably the only plot I'd say that is kinda skippable. It feels like it's just here to set the stage for Zero 3, there even being a post-credits scene to hint at the next set of villains. The important takeaways here are the Dark Elf, the CL system, and Harpuya being the acting leader of Neo Arcadia, and pretty much all of these get re-established again in Zero 3. Even El Piso, one of the central characters to the plot, doesn't even really get mentioned after this. I think someone told me that they bring him up briefly in the intro to Zero 3, but if they do, I don't remember it. So while some important stuff does happen, I don't think that it's important that you hear about it here. But hey, with this not being my favorite entry, maybe I'm prejudiced against it. You get another set of 4 weapons. Sword, Buster, and the Shield Boomerang all are back, and work largely the same. Well, other than that there are less levels for each to unlock, so it's not nearly as difficult to max them out. There's a bit of a trade-off with this, since there's less grinding, which is good, but a few of the abilities have been removed, like the air spin, which was one of my favorite moves. Still, this was a major gripe in the last game, so I do think this is an improvement, even if some sacrifices had to be made. Just a refresher for what leveling entails, hit stuff with a weapon enough times and it'll improve its charge attack or something similar. You can still add elements to stage 3 charges, ice beating elect beating fire, and fire beating ice, which is still a little weird. And then there's the new tool, your triple rod getting destroyed and reforged into the chain rod. Attack in 8 directions, throwing it out for a decent length to strike things with its point. A charge has you twirling it over your head, which doesn't feel all that helpful, but hey, maybe others will. The big appeal though is its ability to latch onto things. Use it to pull blocks or remove enemy shields. Latch onto a surface to pull yourself towards it or hang and swing back and forth, adjusting the length of your tether as you so desire. Just be careful because if you're too close to your target, it won't connect, which can lead to some very unfortunate tumbles. This is probably my favorite game-specific weapon since not only does it have pretty decent range, it can also be fun to yank things around while swinging over some obstacles, and yet, it feels a little overused at points, making me almost resent it. When you've had to swing over 5 beds of spikes in one stage, 3 pits in another, and several ponds of lava in a third, it goes from being a fun gimmick to something that you wish you could trade for an air dash or a double jump instead, especially if you flub a dismount, or if it refuses to stick to what you want it to. If only there were a game that had the same tool, just implemented a bit more smoothly. Oh wait, some of the other mechanics get a shake-up as well. You get a proper game over this time, with failure letting you either retry, reload, or quit. This lets you actually use your lives, rather than just constantly resetting so that you can hoard them all for endgame. And while this is only an option for retry, it also lets you accumulate resources, you saving any elves, weapon, XP, and energy crystals in between tries, so that failures feel less like a waste of time. And speaking of cyber elves, from what I can tell, they work pretty much the same way as last game. Some can be powered up, but each die when you use them. There is one major difference, however. This game has 2 sub-tanks you can find and use in the regular stages, so that you actually have some options to preserve your health without needing to kill a cyber elf, which is huge. And while you can't skip cutscenes, the game only makes you watch them once during an attempt. If you game over before you clear a stage, you'll have to sit through them again then, but otherwise, if you get a boss conversation, die, and then re-enter the room, they won't give you the same speech you just got done reading. While still not perfect, this is such a huge improvement, oh my gosh, copy X. Last game we also talked about EX attacks, where if you fight a boss while at A or S rank, they throw out an extra move. This seemed to be mostly for bragging rights, and also a way to test better players while maybe knocking them down a peg, but here, you actually get something for it. Beat a boss using an EX attack and get their EX skill, which you can toggle on and off to turn one of your attacks into a version of their special move. I'm not quite to the point where I can retain a high rank the whole game and only managed to get the laser shot from the snake and the splitting ice shot from the polar bear, unfortunately both for my buster, but this is really cool. This also highlights the one drawback to having actual game overs this time around. You being able to more readily use extra lives also makes it harder to maintain a high rank. If you die, it'll likely tank your score since not only will you lose points for retrying, but also for any damage taken and time elapsed. Since I wanted to try for more EX skills, there were several times I would SD after failing a level once to reset my score for the stage, making it really sad that I only managed to snag 2 of them despite going tryhard. While it does suck that these are missable, at the same time, they're not super necessary and are a fun extra to strive for once you're more comfortable with the game. Then there's the big addition, forms. You start out with your basic red, but meet the unlock requirements and you can swap colors and abilities, which you can change at any time. Each form has an attack, defense, and speed rating. Some forms just really focus on specific stats. Others give you new abilities, like being able to erase shots with your saber or changing your sword combo. Some of these require you to either have a very specific playstyle, or go out of your way to do something enough times in one stage, probably after looking it up. Playing normally, I usually get only 2 or 3 of these, but doing an extra run on my own, focusing on some of the unlock conditions gave me more to play around with, and I will say enhanced my enjoyment considerably. One even gave me my air spin back. I would recommend looking up a guide and picking out something that works for you. I'm a fan and I think it's a great addition, though I will never unlock Ultimate Form. The game has a total of 16 stages, if I'm not miscounting. An intro, 4 you can choose the order for, 2 intermissions, 4 more any orders, and then 4 more linear ones, leading into the final stage. Kinda feels like that last set should be any order as well, since they're all different locations, but hey, I guess it's just tradition that you do them in a set sequence, even if they're not a single fortress. Anyway, whereas the last game had you going through different mission branches, most of which were optional, possibly depriving you of some missables, 0-2s are all required, and the game's broken up into segments in the order I just mentioned, giving it kind of 3 acts. And hey, you actually get a proper stage select this time. So rather than just a vague description, you can now actually look at a boss headshot and think, flaming chicken, probably a fire level, or big polar bear, maybe an Arctic stage, and actually plan ahead. Amazing! And while some locations are revisited, each has a different layout and some sort of twist to it. Like the airship you boarded earlier later being crashed into the surface, or you visiting the main floor of the lava factory, then crashing down into its basement. How much of a hot commodity is lava in Mega Man anyway that we get so many of these? Never mind. My point is that there's a lot more variety when it comes to locales. And of course there's the base, but other than the command center where you select missions and CL's room where you can save and raise cyber elves, the rest seem to be there mostly for flavor text, though you can correct me if I'm missing something. The missions have been really fleshed out as well. Most of the ones in the first Zero title merely gave you full credit if you completed the stage, but here you can actually do a mission as thoroughly or lazily as you want. Rescue a bunch of resistance members for full marks, or just leave them to flounder while beating the boss yourself. Protect CL from enemies, or just grab a soda and supervise as she disarms a warhead. Your call, but I figure I should help out while I'm in the area. As for the levels themselves, well, they vary. Some are pretty good, I like the train, it's not a hyperfixation, and the temples and Neo Arcadia assault stages have some interesting puzzles pulling around blocks. There's some okay ones like the Ice Temple and, I don't know, maybe the Arctic Computer Bank. And then there are a few excruciating ones, like the Air Fleet where you have to jump from ship to ship, and then have to navigate around some security systems with some really tight timing on shutdowns and restarts. and the damn Crystal Cave, with the invisible platforms over spikes that you need to either memorize the locations of or go really super slowly over. There's also some stages that require the chain rod over and over again, kind of getting you out of the honeymoon phase with it pretty quick, and this game seems to have more spikes, pits, and lava per capita than perhaps any other Mega Man game I've ever played. And for the last set of stages, the Fire, Ice, and Wind temples, each seems to be shorter than the typical level, but with no checkpoints outside of the boss's waiting room, making each, ironically, feel longer in the process. The Fire Temple especially, which is probably my most hated in the series, since it requires you to do the same thing over and over again with the floating bomb capsules and breakable columns, over a river of lava, before making you do a rising lava section, with enemies at the top ready to knock you down into instant death, just when you think you've cleared it. Remind me to talk about enemy placement later. In addition to all that, there's a bunch of side paths and hidden rooms, which I'd normally like, but given that one of the big things you're graded on is time, they really feel counterproductive. Then again, given that most of them net you either cyber elves or energy crystals, both of which I don't really touch, they're probably there more for people who don't care about their rank so much. Still, feels weird that there's this crab sub-boss that you can just never see if you don't happen to take a detour. Overall, I'm not the biggest fan of the levels here, though there are a few I do enjoy. The bosses I'm a little less harsh with. I find the intro boss a bit more annoying than normal, though I can't tell you whether it actually is or if I just have a bad habit of flubbing some of my movements that early in. Polar Camrus is the new Toadman, but Heilig Orobakal and Panter Flowclaws do some interesting things with platforms, though the snake does remind me that when an enemy grabs you in this game, it feels like it takes a bit too long to break out. The 3-4 Guardian rematches play pretty similar to their original iterations, but with an extra move or two thrown in, to keep you on your toes, so I approve. Same for the Rainbow Devil. There's two regular bosses worth calling out though. Phoenix Magnian is kind of a pain. First you have to bait him to trigger a counter, which is when he's actually vulnerable. And trying to figure out which of his dupes is actually him can also be a bit frustrating. Plus, having to deal with the floor erupting in the middle of all this when there's already so much happening feels like a bit much. Still though, there are counters for just about all of his bullcrap, and getting his patterns down to really spank him feels good. So the only thing I'm going to totally count against him is that I don't think he should be an early game boss. I guess with how they structured it, that's kinda where they needed to slot him in, but I still think it's kinda bull that they expect you to take on one of the most challenging fights that soon. Then there's the one that I'm going to, likely controversially, call the worst boss in the game, Burble Heckalot. He grabs the walls to shake down caterpillars that he eats to grow bigger, the greens making him one stage larger, while the yellows get him all the way up to his full size. He gets more attacks the bigger he gets, and at max, he can expand into a ball to become invincible and roll around the room. After going off screen, it can be hard to predict whether he'll stick to the walls or just crash down on top of you, and he can do this move multiple times in a row, giving you little to no chance to counterattack. He has no weaknesses, and though all it takes to shrink him again is smacking him, he doesn't take damage until he's back to his base size. The strategy really is just killing his bugs before he can eat them, especially the yellows, but sometimes they'll just fall right on top of him, letting him immediately gobble them down. So if I could label one fight unfair, it'd be this. According to the Complete Works, he was in the running to be Phantom's replacement, so maybe they meant for him to be kinda busted. As for boss order, fight the snake first, since his stage has a sub-tank in it. Then the polar bear, since she's a pushover, and just follow the weaknesses from there. As for the second set, choose your own order, but the frog does have another sub-tank. Moving on, you later rematch the Guardians, only this time they turn into vehicles, namely a Big Wheels, a Stingray sub, and a Robo Dynablade. And while I normally think the characters look cool in the Zero series, all the other bosses have top-notch designs in my opinion, I just think these look so stupid. The only one I kind of like is Phantom's, which is only concept art since he's still dead. The fights themselves are also kinda lame, just more weakness exploitation while zeroing in on their small hitboxes and figuring out the best cheese. And then during the boss rush, which only has 6 fights this time, we get a special fight against the Beetle Boys. While Kuangus Ankus was about the standard difficulty with only his annoying grab and mandible sometimes blocking shots being the notable parts, he fights with his bro in the final stage. And yeah, they don't do anything too crazy, just having a larger health bar and taking turns attacking, other than their dash move, which you can simply duck under. It's a neat idea, but them killing me when they crash together after I've already killed them kinda makes it hard for me to look favorably on the fight. And then there's the final boss. I'd say that Elpizo's first form is kind of tricky with all the moves he can pull, including a health drain and his ability to block, though when he occasionally summons other enemies, you can potentially get health drops from him. I'd say he's tougher than Copy X's first form, but his second, well, it's really anticlimactic. It has a big ol' hitbox that can be struck with the chain rod or even charge slash from the floor, and most of its attacks come out close to its body, so with as wide as the room is, you can hug the wall and just take shots from there. And even if it does warp closer to the sides, that just makes it easier to rush up and smack it, and if you're worried about getting too close, you can just run away until it moves to a better position for you. Yeah, it does hit hard, but I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that, with just a bit of understanding with how it works, it's the second easiest boss in the game, which feels really wrong. Overall, while I don't mind most of the boss fights, I just don't feel like this is the best balanced roster, and how they managed to make even the super cool 4 Guardians look lame here, well, at least compared to the other games in the series, it might be the weakest entry. Guess I am still being a bit harsh. Visually, the game's pretty similar to 0-1. While some of the regular sprites seem to be the same or at least similar, a lot of the profile pics for dialogue seem new and do look a bit nicer. And I already talked about how I think the bosses look cool. Well, most of them. I also don't get quite as bored looking at the levels in this game. Part of it's just that, while several of the locations do get reused, they're not as much. Some of them showing up maybe twice here as opposed to, what, 4 or so times through that damn desert? Not only that, but a lot of them are just honestly more interesting to look at. A jungle leading into an old temple, with architecture that reminds me of Reaverbots. A massive airship with an internal hangar. The train from last game, but fleshed out into a full stage, with some sections where you can either stay up top or actually move through the locomotive. Still have some complaints with the layout, but more pleasant to look at, so we're back to positives. The music also feels a lot more varied this time. I described 0-1's OST as feeling anxiety-inducing and moody, but here, it sounds more like I'd expect a Mega Man game to. Sure, there's definitely still some oppressive bits there, heck, a few tracks even return, but there's more that sound like they're not meant to depress you. Platinum and Power Bomb are more high energy and get me hyped up, while Gravity makes me question whether I'm heading for some Western showdown. And Departure is just really pretty. There's something determined, something desperate about it, and honestly, it's just a really great track, the sort that's just pleasant to listen to on its own, especially if you can find some nice remixes. My point is that while I did kind of like the previous OST, 0-2's just seems a lot better to me, since there's a greater range of styles and emotions in the tracks, so the game gets another compliment. And just tacking this on, since it's also in the sound department, I noticed the voice work in this one a lot more, too. While there was some in the first game, there seemed to be more lines given to the bosses here during their fights that, while not totally necessary, adds a little something to the experience. Also Elpizo's laugh. 0-2 might be the hardest in the series. 0-4 has some pretty tricky spots, the way 0-1 setup makes it hard to tolerate, while 0-3 is just right. Still though, 0-2's difficulty is a little unique. There's what I'd call an actual challenge, creating specific scenarios to test a player's skill and help them grow. There's the artificial type, like just making enemies take way too much damage while making your own character fragile. And then there's also the kind caused by incompetence, where either your range of abilities doesn't match what the game's expecting of you, or things are just so poorly put together that it becomes annoying. See my review on 0-1. The difficulty here feels mean-spirited though. There's a few things that remain from the previous game, like the text box once killed me by covering up a floor that was actually a bed of spikes, and the ranking and elf systems are still the same, so they're there by design. Besides that, the enemy placement is really bad. Sometimes things will zoom in from off screen, which I would normally attribute to how small the GBA was, but there was another part where I had to climb a tower, alternating walls so that I didn't get hit by the surface-crawling death tops, with there being basically no warning before they just slide into view and nick me. Your view is a lot more limited vertically than horizontally, which kinda makes me question whether these surprise enemies were on purpose. Then there's just how many ledges have enemies camping out on the top, ready to hit you as soon as you try to find solid footing, possibly killing you by knocking you back down, depending on how dangerous it is the way you came. Then there's just how many hazards are in this game. Spikes, pits, lava, sometimes combined with other obstacles like ice. There's also sections that are aggravating, like the Crystal Cave and the Air Fleet, where you either have to wait around for things to get in position, or rush and probably die due to a stupid mistake. On top of that, there's sections that just have you doing the same damn thing over and over again, where the slightest mistake will get you killed. The Fire Temple certainly comes to mind, but I think the best example is from the last stage, where you have to climb a ladder, then drop down onto the next, 3 times. The fact that you need to do the same thing several times in a row, while there's also an extra life right after the checkpoint failure takes you back to if you're desperate enough to go after it, kinda makes me think that they knew that it can be tricky judging when to swap from hitting right to up, and gives the impression of a sadist forcing someone to do something they really don't want to do while they look on in pleasure. There's also all the side sections that seem there more to waste your time, and they aren't always generous with checkpoints. I guess it's mostly a level design thing, but maybe the bosses only feel more manageable by comparison. This game is an asshole. Inti Creates is an asshole. Still, there are ways to mitigate some of this. Just in case I didn't make this clear enough with some of my comments, I do not use Cyber Elves and I'm trying to work my way up to consistent A ranks, so I care about my score more than most. As such, other players probably won't mind some of the detours and also won't be shy about using elves, which can help with some of these issues, like getting rid of spikes. Then of course there's the different forms. If you're having trouble in one area, find a form that will help you compensate, like one that grants high defense or one that makes energy drop more often to keep yourself alive. Heck, I got a lot of use out of the X form, since it powered up my Buster and made it so that I could always have 2 powerful attacks charged up at once, since I was using Control Type B. And you know what? With hazard and enemy placement being some of my main gripes, I'm actually reminded of another Inti Creates title that I initially hated, Mega Man 9. So many bad things you just couldn't see coming, so many insta-deaths that I would call that game unfair, and yet once I learned where to expect enemies and how to get the most out of my weapons, all of a sudden I was having a blast. The game seems to be designed around multiple playthroughs, you learning what works for you, what aspects of the game you want to engage with, and where it's likely to throw something at you with next to no warning, heck, maybe even getting through that one damn cave without needing to reveal the floor. I guess where I'll leave this is that the game is hard, but learnable. I did 3 playthroughs of this game to prepare, once on stream and once by myself. I started typing this up, felt like my last run just went really poorly and that maybe I wasn't giving it a fair shake, so I did one more run, which I worried would only make me hate it more, but surprisingly, I actually kind of almost had fun. I think I'll start referring to Zero 2 as being like Mega Man 9, but more complex. Like I said, I hated that one when I first played it, but it did wind up becoming one of my favorites. I think I can learn to love this one too, but I'm not quite there yet. That does make it hard for me to say whether Zero 2 is a good game or not, though. If you're the type to just play through a game once, I think you'll probably have a miserable time and wind up seeing the title as unfair. If you're more the sort of person who wants to hammer through a game again and again, you can get a lot out of its different forms, finding the optimal routes, and the nuances of things like the chain rod. Heck, I'd say the game lends itself better than most to challenge runs. You may be locking yourself into specific loadouts, trying to unlock all the forms, or just a good old-fashioned speedrun. Perhaps it's a casual's hell and a tryhard's paradise. Might be a good time to remind everyone about all those difficulty options the collection adds in. To answer the initial question, I think Zero 2 is an improvement over 1, a few things, mostly the level design, just rub me the wrong way. My own opinion continues to evolve on this one, so maybe it'll be worth another look sometime down the line, perhaps a re-review in another 2 years. Not that anyone probably remembers the first. But hey, I've rambled enough, so how about you? Do you like Zero 2? Consider it an improvement over the first? Do you think the difficulty's a little much? Am I too whiny? And who is the hardest boss this round? Thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into Mega Man. Hell's Gate Open, which will actually be relevant next time.